Just a quick introduction to myself. So my name is Halley Kalyan, and I have a background in engineering and management, so on. So I'm just like your average person working in some corporate job, but I do have a lot of interest in some of these key topics, particularly pertaining to Hindu tradition in our times today, and that is what really brings me here. And in this particular topic today, what we are going to delve into is really around all the dissenting opinions that were voiced across the country in 1945 when the Hindu Law Committee went all around the country seeking opinions, and there was a whole lot of people who gave opinions both in favor and in against. In particularly, I'm going to focus on those who have dissented because I think there's a lot for us to learn in contemporary times from what are the grounds on which people objected to the Hindu law then, the Hindu Code Bill, as it is popularly called in later times, and what can we learn from those grounds of rejection or dissent or protest that we have seen from a whole bunch of people back then. So at a very high level, some of you may be aware and some of you may not, but I'm not going to delve too deep into the actual content of the Hindu Code Bill, because that's something that is available on all over the internet, on Wikipedia, anywhere. Just a cursory glance will give you a very quick idea of what that bill was about. Essentially, it was a particular legislative intervention where there was an attempt to codify various Hindu customs and Hindu laws into under one bill, which later got broken into, let's say, 4 bills in the early 50s when the Nehru government actually got established. So this bill essentially tried to codify aspects around marriage, aspects around inheritance, and various other such things, which typically are today called, they are classified under the ambit of personal law. So in today's talk, I'm not really going to get into the specifics of what did the bill try to attempt in terms of inheritance, what did it try to attempt in terms of joint family or in terms of marriages and so on. I think that's a deep topic on its own, and that's not really the intent of this talk today. What I'm trying to focus on today, as I mentioned, is that I'm trying to focus on what are the grounds on which people objected to this legislative intervention back then, and what is it that we can learn from that, given everything else that is happening in our times today. So as I mentioned, a lot of what I'm going to use in the talk today, they're all going to be from primary factual evidence of a lot of people all across the country who have given either written statements or oral evidence to the Hindu Law Committee in 1945. So this is before independence, 2 years before independence. So you'd actually see people from, let's say, Pakistan also give their opinions. Hindus from Pakistan also give opinions on this Hindu Law Committee in that era. So this whole content, it kind of goes about into 1500 pages. There's a whole lot of opinions there, and hundreds of people have given opinions. So what I'm doing here is really cherry picking some of those which are against the bill and which have some kind of a contemporary relevance to what we are experiencing in our times today. And these opinions, as I mentioned, what is interesting here is also that they are all across the country, including Pakistan, Lahore, Rawalpindi, Quetta, Peshawar. You'll see Balochistan. You'll see a whole bunch of people in Pakistan also respond. They are actually Sanatana, Dharmic, Sabhas, and all of those kind of institutions that were really alive in Pakistan till 1945. And even they were voicing their opinions on the Hindu law bills. And in India also, you'd see hundreds and hundreds of bodies, really, which are non-political bodies. These are bodies which are formed by concerned Hindus, and these are bodies that have private bodies that have voiced their opinions on this particular bill. And this dissent is really spread across caste, across religion, across gender, and across region, so on. So the religion aspect is also important because one very interesting intervention that the legislatures around this bill have done was really to club Jains and Buddhists and Sikhs along under the umbrella of Hindus and tried to codify their laws as well. And a lot of changes happened from the initial model to what is present now. But essentially in 1945, you would see, let's say, Jains come and speak up saying that this attempt to codify the Jain law and Hindu law together under this form of one codified law is something that we resist, because Jain traditions are different, Jain customs are different, so on. So you would find such opinions as well. And out of all these hundreds of associations that have voiced opinions, you'd also see, let's say, a lot of Pitadipatis and Matadipatis, like the Shankaracharyas of various Pitams and various other such religious authorities who have also spoken up. So the purpose behind trying to recollect some of those opinions from 1945 in 2022 today is to really to explain that, that there are people who engaged in public discourse on important matters on tradition. And these were all, though they were, let's say, Pitatipatis and Shankaracharyas, so on, these were not people who just confined themselves to their own tapas or sadhana, but they considered this sphere of social political activism and public discourse as equally important. So we did have a lot of real religious traditional people who engaged in public discourse, and they resisted as well. So a lot of them, they didn't stay quiet. And a lot of these hundreds of associations and bodies were just bodies that were formed of concerned private individuals and not necessarily associated, let's say, with the Hindu Mahasabha or with the Congress or with any other such burgeoning political parties of that era. And that is again something very interesting contrast to our times today, because today, at the moment you are trying to conduct a public discourse on any of these topics, people try to bucket you into one political party or the other and try to portray you as a let's say you are a pro-BJP person, anti-BJP person, or a pro-Congress, a pro-communist, so on and so forth. But in that era, if you see, these were really independent bodies that were standing for Hinduism. They were not really bodies that were tagging themselves to a political party. Of course, it was pre-independence, so the democracy and the vote bank politics really didn't catch up, perhaps. But then that is what it is, and there is really something for us to learn from there, that you can continue to have Hindu or tradition focused public discourse and not necessarily align with a particular political party. So the contemporary relevance of a lot of these topics are coming up really because if you look at what happened, let's say a couple of weeks or 2-3 weeks ago on the whole hijab issue in Karnataka, again you have, if you had followed the court proceedings there, you'd notice that there are a few lawyers who are really trying to read translations of Quran and then trying to make some judgments on what is essential to Islam and what is not. And this is something that has happened, let's say, in the case of Hinduism in the past as well. If you take the issue of the Sabarimala temple entry, there was again something very similar done, where a bench of judges or lawyers, they try to interpret religion and then make judgments based on that, because they have the authority to do so. So this whole issue of what is religion, what is tradition, and who has the competency or authority to interpret and legislate on tradition, that keeps coming back to us, just as how it happened in 1945, it keeps coming back to us even now in 2022, where we continue to have this friction between what is a religious space and what is the space for legislature, judiciary, executive, so on. So now, apart from, let's say, Sabarimala and hijab, you have also seen this show up, let's say, in the case of the age of marriage, where in the recent past, we've again seen some proposals and interventions where the age of marriage has been, the proposal was to increase it from 18 years to 21 years, so on. And then there are people who say, why should it be 21? It should be 25. That's more progressive. That will allow for women to study more, so on and so forth, and settle down and all of that. So everybody has an opinion on these topics, right? So you find this happen. And you also find, let's say now, there are petitions pending around the same-sex marriage, where people who want to marry within the within their own gender, the same sex, they want to attribute sanctity to that form of marriage through the Hindu Marriage Act. So again, there are questions where that come in here on terms of like what is the Hindu view here really? What is tradition? And it comes back to the same point of who is the authority to interpret tradition, and is there one tradition, and on what basis can we really pass a judgment on whether such kind of reforms or progressive proposals can be accepted or rejected. So these friction between reform and tradition is something that played out then and is something that plays out now. The only difference really, if you see, is that at that point in time in our history, there were hundreds and thousands of concerned people who are actually standing strong on their foot and saying that I represent my tradition, and this is my interpretation of my tradition, this is my guru's interpretation of my tradition, or my sampradaya's interpretation of my tradition, and whatever you are proposing is against my tradition. But today's time, if you see, there aren't enough Hindus who are really standing for their tradition. The voices that dominate our public discourse are really the voices of liberal Hindus, both on the right wing and the left wing. So it is typically pro-reform voices that dominate our public discourse. And the attempt here through this talk is to throw light on the kind of a traditionalist response that had emerged in that era, and to see what is it that we can learn, if at all you are getting increasingly concerned about the pace of reforms and the kind of proposals that are coming in the name of progress. The attempt here is really to say that there is really a whole body of work from where you can draw some inspiration in terms of how did our own ancestors, or how did our own forefathers and how did they resist this kind of reform, and what worked for them and what didn't. So again, just to conclude on that note, in terms of the flavor of reforms, just like a couple of days ago, if you had followed the discussions that were happening around the US Supreme Court nominees, there was this question asked on, so somebody, one Republican elected representative, she asked a question to the Supreme Court judge nominee, asking, can you define a woman? And then the court nominee, the judge nominee, she says that I cannot define a woman, I'm not a biologist, so on. So the kind of discourse that is happening around progress today is going into all sorts of territories, which let's say somebody in 1945 could not have imagined. But given that everything else has been reformed, now the whole gender politics is hot, and that's where a lot of reform activity is now happening around gender, let's say. And this question will again come back that, okay, I mean, this is what is happening in the West. This is what is coming back to India from the same actors. Now, how should I respond to this as a concerned Hindu? What does my tradition even say about such aspects, right? So these are questions that keep coming. So the tradition reform friction is something that keeps playing out again and again, just that the nature of reform and our own understanding and practice of tradition might keep changing from time to time. And in this process, what has also happened is that given that a lot of us Hindus have had decades and decades of secular education, and our own livelihoods also have been largely secular, removed from religion, we are also in this position where a lot of us really don't have a good hold on what our tradition really is. And in fact, there are a bunch of popular internet handles on the Hindu Twitter, let's say, who say that reform is our tradition. We can always reform. We are an evolving religion, and so on. So that kind of discourse really weakens a lot of us in terms of our own understanding of a tradition. Because if reform is your only tradition, and if it is all about evolution, then what is it that you stand for? What are your red lines? And what are your non-negotiables, right? So these are questions that are very important, and one can find some inspiration on what is it that let's say some of our ancestors considered as non-negotiables back then in 1945, and what were their arguments. So I'm just trying to throw some light onto that piece of our own history, and then trying to learn from that history to see what we can do in terms of public discourse and change in our own times today. So let me first start with this particular opinion that the Ahmedabad Bar Association voiced in 1945 as a part of their opinions that they submitted to the Hindu Law Committee. So the Bar Association of Ahmedabad, they said this, that the Hindu law is based not on mere proprietary claims or on mere social fabric of family property as under the English law or any other personal law for that matter. And it is grounded on sacred principles of religion, which have from times immemorial been the basis of conduct of a Hindu from birth, and it is seen as such throughout his life. So the Bar Association, they try to emphasize that we are not like how, let's say, the English law or the civil law, they are operated. We are different, and we have sacred principles, and our law comes from our own sacred principles. And they try to emphasize this fact, which is a thread that you find across several such dissenting opinions of that era, that they said that there is a Queen Victoria's proclamation, which is quite popular in the colonial era, where the proclamation says that in matters of religion and personal law, the subjects of Queen Victoria, which is our own ancestors who are colonized, they will have the fullest liberty. So the Victoria's proclamation really says that on matters of religion and personal law, the colonial government is not going to intervene. Of course, I mean, while they did say that, they did intervene here and there on various other topics, but they never, they didn't try to do what the Hindu Law Committee tried to do in 1945. Though there were attempts in between, there were protests and they came back, they went back. But this kind of a massive reformist attempt was something that was attempted really in the 40s and then fructified in the 50s with Nehru and Ambedkar. And this was not something that was really considered as important by the colonial era authorities, and they neither pushed for it as something that needs to be done no matter what. Now, here's another opinion from somebody called B Joshi, who was a pleader in Pune. So he says that he opposes the codification of Hindu law on the grounds that Smritis, which are the fountains of Hindu law, they form part of the Vedas, and the Smritis were never creatures of the crown. Let me repeat. So he says Smritis were never creatures of the crown. The duty of the crown is to simply administer the laws as laid down in the Smritis, and the crown has no power invested in it to frame laws on matters dealing that are dealt with by the Smritis. So essentially, he's trying to say that the Smritis are sacred, and the Smritis were from they originated from the Vedas, and they were never creatures of the crown, which means that the king or any other authority like the colonial authority which is replacing the king, they are not the ones who are creating the Smritis. The Smritis are the ones that were created by the rishis, who in turn are not they are not like authors in the same sense of somebody saying that I wrote a book. So these were the rishis in turn, they are narrating whatever they are calling a Smriti is really coming straight from the Vedas, or as an interpretation or an elaboration or explanation of what is explained in the Vedas. So this is again a common thread that one would find in various voices that were raised in that era, where they tried to again and again emphasize that there is an innate sacred quality in our laws and they are not secular in nature. So again, let me quote one more opinion from another Sabha from Ahmedabad. So this is called a Sanatana Vedic Dharma Sabha in Ahmedabad. And what they are suggesting here is that what they are trying to say is that the Hindus cannot accept or tolerate any representatives secularly elected for secular purposes dabbling into a culture and then trying to change laws that were given to the Hindus by their divine sages and saints. And such interference, the Sabha says, is ab initio null and void. So if you see their defense here, they are trying to say that the people who are trying to amend or change these laws, they are secular representatives elected for secular purposes. And the Hindu religion has rules on marriage, has rules on inheritance, and a secular authority has no business trying to poke its finger into this. So again, this is a separation where they are trying to draw between what is secular and what is religious, as was known then, to draw a red line saying that for us Hindus, these particular aspects that you are trying to meddle with in the name of law reforms or code bill, these are like sacred topics, and a secular authority has no business getting into this. And they also say this, which is again a very important point, that they say that the code robs the Hindus of the sanctity of their law, of the Sanskrit basis of their laws, of the customary moldings of the law, and of the stability of the law and the uniformity of its divine basis. So if you look at what they're trying to emphasize here, they say the sanctity of the law, which is again the sacred nature of the law, the Sanskrit basis of the law. So all of these smritis and many other such sutras and Nibandha Granthas, so on, they were all in Sanskrit. And this Hindu code bill, like how the constitution turned out later, they were all English-focused renditions. And there was really no effort done to for the Hindu code bill, let's say, to make it Sanskrit first. And they were all very English-focused renditions done for an audience which is trained in English, thinks in English, writes in English, talks in English. So that's a very strange contradiction that a lot of the traditional bodies tried to bring up in that particular era. And if you notice that the other piece that this Sabha tried to emphasize, they talked about the customary moldings of the law. So again, this is something very interesting in terms of how our own law manifested in reality over the years, that we had this very, very strong practicing customs across various regions, jatis, and time zones, so on, time eras, so on. So you have these customs, which sometimes it might appear that they are conflicting with smritis, and sometimes they might appear to be dealing with procedures that are not directly addressed by smritis, so on. But there was never a conflict that was seen between the smriti, Veda, Shastra kind of a discourse and the achara or vyavahara and customs that used to happen across various regions. So there was a kind of a synthesis, or there was a kind of a way in which both the sadachara mode, from where the customs used to get their sanctity, and then the whole smriti shastra discourse, from where a certain set of rules and laws used to emerge. So we always had these two flavors of discourse that used to operate, where you have a custom driven kind of a law framework, and where you also had a shastra smriti kind of a law framework. And if you try to understand this oft repeated phrase of unity and diversity, the diversity really stemmed from all of these customs and all of these various forms of acharas that were there, lokacharas, kulacharas, deshacharas, so on. But there was also a unity aspect, and that unity was really coming from this Sanskritic and divine basis of a lot of these laws. And if you look at it, the way the whole Smriti Shastra discourse kind of navigated with all of these customs and acharas, that is really the model of unity and diversity on how our law really operated, where you never try to aspire for a uniformity in terms of a sameness of what needs to be done in, let's say, on the matter of marriage, on the matter of inheritance, or any other such issues. And there was always this carefully negotiated discussion that used to happen between what the custom says and what the Shastra says. And sometimes the way of the Shastra used to be what the people used to adopt, and sometimes the way of the custom used to be what people used to adopt, and sometimes both used to coexist, and they used to change based on the context. So from that kind of an operating model, the code really tries to get onto this kind of a uniform or one prescription for all kind of a methodology, which is very, very different from how the Hindu mind used to think then. And despite all the reforms, there are various parts of the Hindu mind that is there in each one of us today, which continues to grapple with this kind of a model of uniformity versus unity and diversity. And so this particular Dharma Sabha, in fact, they went the next step, and they also said that the only way to utilize the wasted money, energy, and talents on making this new code is to make it applicable only to those people who get themselves registered to be governed by it. And the whole thing, they say, that will then be exposed. So that's actually a very clever way of asking for, let's say, a plebiscite on the Hindu code bill, where this Dharma Sabha is really saying that if I, as a traditional Hindu, want to follow what my tradition says, let me be. If somebody else says, I don't like what the tradition says, I want to follow the Hindu code bill, let him register for the Hindu code bill and let him follow that. So that is a kind of, if you can look at it as a way in which the sampradaya or traditional way of resolving conflicts in the past as well, where if there are massive disagreements and there is just non-negotiable, like the synthesis is cannot be negotiated at all. In those cases, it was always a new sampradaya that used to get created, and people could still follow that. So if you look at a lot of reform movements of that era, like the Brahmo Samaj, for example, they ended up creating their own sampradayas of sorts. And there was a model of coexistence that was built. Of course, it didn't sustain for various reasons. That's a different debate altogether. But you can see this kind of an argument that was thrown during the Hindu code bill debates, where there were indeed some Dharma Sabhas which have said this, that let people register to be governed by it, but don't disturb me, because I didn't authorize you to do this job for me. You are a secular authority. And if you are really so interested, open it up for registration, and whoever wants to do it, let them do it. That's a very bold argument. Of course, needless to say, it didn't fly, but it is still something useful, as it gives us some understanding of the various forms of resistance that emerged in that era. And again, this Sanatana Vedic Dharma Sabha, they again emphasize this point that the Hindus have not made any demand for the Hindu code, nor do they need it. And this aspect that there was no popular demand for Hindu court is something you would find across various other such people who gave their dissenting opinions, that this was not some kind of a popular movement where people took to the streets. Let's say it was not like some kind of Dandi march that Gandhiji conducted, or some kind of a Swadeshi kind of a movement where people used to burn the clothes in fire, and there was no symbolism either around all of this. These were just muted movements here and there. These proposals used to show up, and some very vocal people who were close to power. These were the people who were kind of making a lot of noise on these aspects, and the general Hindu population, they weren't taking to the streets saying that I want a Hindu code bill, I want my tradition to be amended. And that's an important point that the Dharma Sabha brought up then. And they also said this, that it is not a matter for secular legislation, and in our opinion, it is beyond the sphere of the government's jurisdiction. So this is something that continues to play even in our era today. As I mentioned, that a lot of times when these case or discussions go to the courts of law, there are always people who say that this is not in the jurisdiction of the court. Why is this court even trying to define what needs to happen let's say in a place of worship? So in the case of Shabarimala temple, let's say this was an argument that many people took, that what business does a court have to define what should happen inside a temple, but that too in a secular country. So this kind of what is the jurisdiction of the government, what is the jurisdiction of the legislature, judiciary, so on matters of tradition. I think that's an important topic that we should continue to engage with, because there are several open threads left open there, and all kinds of interventions continue to happen even to our era today. Now, let me jump on to another opinion, which was offered by somebody called Thakur Prasad Dubey, who was a civil judge in Farrukhabad, Fatehgarh in Uttar Pradesh. And so what Thakur Prasad Dubey says is that he says this, that a lot of people assign some kind of a fault to our own rishis and maharshis. They say that whatever the rishis and maharshis have done, these smritis and various laws like this, they have intermingled religion and morality with secular law, and they have created too many religious laws, while they should all have been left to, let's say, the secular sphere. Now, Dubeji here says that whether whatever our rishis have done, whether that is conducive to the welfare of mankind, or is it in their best interest, meaning whether they did it for their selfish interest, is a different matter, and that is something that requires a grave consideration. That's a different topic altogether, because you do see people today say that a lot of these smritis were made by Brahmins, and they were doing to perpetrate Brahminical hegemony, so on and so forth. So these are not topics that are really of specific interest at this moment for this talk, but then they were also topics that the people in that era wrestled with. So here what Dubeji is trying to say is that this whole accusation that our rishis just intervene too much into every single aspect of our life with their laws, while they should have left some of it to the secular sphere. And that is the accusation that Thakur Prasad Dubey is trying to refute. So he asked this question, which is a very, very important question for each one of us, again, in our era today. He asked this question, that what value can a law carry if it is not fundamentally based on rules of ethics and morality? So he's first trying to draw this separation, that if you are making a law, that needs to have some values. And what are those values if they are not based on certain rules of ethics and morality? And what value can these rules of ethics and morality carry if they are not ingrained in the basic principles of the religion of a people? So this whole clamor today to somehow define some kind of a secular ethic, which either has nothing to do with religion or is something that will appeal to all religions, is something that needs to be contested, because it is very, very difficult to define this kind of a secular ethic, which has either nothing to do with religion or applies effectively in the same way to all religions. And that is something really at the heart of the uniform civil code debate as well, because you are trying to establish some sort of a uniformity across various faiths and belief systems. And in here you have people like Thakur Prasad Dubey who are asking this very question, that how can you define law without values? And how can you have values without rules on ethics and morality? And how can you have rules on ethics and morality without them being strongly founded in a particular religion of a people? So I think this is a very important point here. And Thakur Prasad Dubey ji, he elaborates much further on this. And again, that's a very, very important point for our times today, because a lot of us Hindus today don't even think of our own religion this way. So let's see what Thakurji says. So he says this, that the dharma or religion for the Hindus, it is not a matter of a few minutes of stay in a temple or a church. It is the very life and being of life. Life not only here, but the eternal cycle of life hereafter. Let me repeat. The dharma or religion for the Hindus is not a matter of few minutes of stay in a temple or a church. It is the very life and being of life. Life not only here, but the eternal cycle of life hereafter. The Sanskrit root of dharma is dhr, which means to sustain, and dharma is the one that sustains the entire universe and the entire sentient beings. Our laws have been made not for this life alone, but also for those that have yet to come. That there is some beyond, even the non-believers believe. And if our rishis have planned for that beyond, there is nothing foolish about it. So he's trying to say that what we think of dharma as Hindus, or what they thought of dharma as Hindus then in their era, it was not about a few minutes of stay in a temple. And that is, I think, very, very important for our times today, because a lot of us Hindus today, while we have taken to all kinds of works for our own secular livelihood options, and we indulge in a lot of political discussions, we really don't try to understand what does it mean to be a Hindu, and what does my tradition even say on what it means to be a Hindu. And that's really where this point of it is not a matter of a few minutes of stay in a temple really is very important. Because today we think that if I'm doing my puja in my puja room, if I visit a temple once in a while, if I, let's say, conduct a vratam or two, if I attend to some pravachanam or something by 2 or 3 religious gurus, and participate in 2 or 3 public functions, and take a few photos, put it on Instagram, put it on Facebook, or whatever, that makes me a good Hindu. But that's not how our ancestors thought of themselves, and that's not how our tradition defines Hinduism even to this day. And that is really where this aspect of what is dharma and what is the real expanse of dharma comes into the picture. And when you talk of law and dharma, also this point is important, that our laws have been planned not for this life alone, and also for the life that is yet to come. And that's really where the whole secular worldview and the atheistic worldview kind of conflicts. That if somebody says that there is this whole eternal cycle of life hereafter, there is this idea of moksha, there is this idea of punarjanma, karma, papam, punyam. And if there is somebody else who says, I don't believe in all this, I just believe in the here and now, what is popularly called YOLO, you only live once. It is, some people tend to imagine that the YOLO view and this Punarjanma karma view can both kind of coexist together, and we can still have some form of a secular law or a uniform law for both these people. But if you look at these kind of dissenting opinions of that era, it really becomes clear that it is very, very difficult to assume that we can somehow synthesize both these worldviews and propose one set of laws to both. So here, Thakurji is trying to emphasize that it is not just about the here and now. Our tradition believes there is something beyond this, and there are multiple recurring janmas and differing recurring lives. And dharma is not just for humans, it is also for the entire sentient beings. And that's where they're trying to draw this difference, that dharma is not the same as your English law, your common law, or secular law, so on. So you cannot assume that you can somehow take some aspects of out of dharma on marriage, on inheritance, on anything else, and then say that let me just secularize this and let the other part of your life be religious. So that's where again Thakur Prasad Dubey ji makes a very, very important point. So he says this, that there are no compartments in our dharma. A man cannot be secular sometimes and religious at other times. Let me repeat. There are no compartments in our dharma. A man cannot be secular sometimes and religious at other times. So this really goes to the heart of the whole discourse that emerged in colonialism and the modern era, that the assumption always was you could separate these two spheres. And their assumption really came from the experience of Europe, where they had this whole imagery of a church-state separation. And they assumed that they could do the same even in Hindu India. And these kind of statements from our own ancestors really help us to, understand the conflict in that model, that our tradition didn't see compartments in Dharma, and we did not differentiate between secular life and religious life. So it was not possible for you to be secular sometimes and religious at other times. So let me go to another opinion, which was voiced by Professor S L Dasgupta. So he again tries to emphasize this point on customs, where he says that the customs in different localities, they grow into law, and such a growth, particularly in civil institutions, they should be left to the general public opinion and not should be initiated from outside. So he says this thing that in a great country like India, we have different races and different legal and customary traditions live. So you should not try to uniformize all of these customs in the name of a law code from top. And this top-down approach is not something that they advise. And they say that you should give it time, and you should give it time to emerge from the general public opinion. So it is more of a bottom-up kind of a view on how customs try to change to accommodate the various demands that come in changing times, and it's not necessarily something that should come from the top down. So again, here he tries to emphasize that the fundamental principle of Hinduism that all Hindus should follow, that they should follow the Hindu Smriti Shastras, and the Smriti Shastra discourse also includes the time-honored local customs as well. So you cannot offer a newfangled Hindu code as a substitute for the Hindu Shastra, because it doesn't have this kind of an imagery in terms of how to handle all this diversity on time-honored local customs, and how to marry that back with the top-down, let's say, discourse on the or the meta-narrative, larger macro narrative on the Smriti Shastras. What they attempted to do with the uniform code was to really ignore a bunch of what the Smritis were saying, ignore all these diversities in local customs, and just define one code as a uniform code for everybody. And that's something that a lot of our own ancestors resisted. Now, here, let me bring attention into another opinion that was voiced by somebody called Mahamahopadhyaya Chandidas Nyayatarkatita. So he says this thing, that this legislature that is trying to make this Hindu code bill, it is composed of heterogeneous elements. Some of them are Hindus by name, but they're really un-Hindus. Which is basically they are just Hindus, what is today called HINO, Hindus in name only. So these are people who are just namesake Hindus. There are a bunch of non-Hindus in the legislature, and these people are not competent to legislate on religious matters which are inherent in our social rights and social customs, and much less on Hindu religious laws which have evolved from the wise and far-sighted rishis of the old and from the Vedic texts. And the secrets of these Vedic texts and Smritis, they cannot be appreciated by people of modern times who have no culture of Vedas and Shastras, far less any insight into them. So he's really trying to contest the competence of these legislative bodies, which are trying to pass laws onto Hindu rights and customs. And he's trying to say this, that unless you are competent in religion, just because you are a part of legislature, you should not even attempt to do such things. So he says this, that even if one argues that the legislature is legally competent to legislate on religious matters, the members cannot surely be considered to be qualified enough for the purpose. So even if, let's say, you argue that I am an elected body by people, or in this case appointed by the British government, and so I'm a quasi representative of what the government should be, and hence I'm legally competent. But even if you are legally competent to do this kind of reform, you are not qualified to do this from a traditional standpoint. So even let's say if you agree that they are qualified, Mahamahopadhyaya Chandidas Nyayatarkatita, he continues his questioning. He says that even if you are qualified, where is the demand for such reforms as the Rao committee or the Hindu law committee is contemplating? How many Hindus have asked for this? What part of the entire Hindu population has demanded such changes? What is their number? What is their proportion? And are they even Hindus? So these are all questions that they ask then. And he very interestingly goes back to reference from 1872, where a special marriage act was enacted by a British appointed person called James Fitzstephen. And James, in his discourse on the special marriage act, says this, that be a Hindu or not, as you please, but be one thing or the other. So if you look at the context on the Special Marriage Act, they were trying to get legal sanctity on some forms of marriage and some form of concession related to marriage outside of the Hindu fold. In that context is where James Fitzstephen is making this remark, that be a Hindu or not, as you please, but be one thing or the other. Don't ask me to undertake this impossible task of constructing a compromise between Hinduism and non-Hinduism, which will enable you to evade the necessity of knowing your own minds. So what he's really trying to say is that you first be clear whether you want to follow the Hindu tradition or you want to step out of it and follow the non-Hindu tradition. But don't try to define, ask me to define this one law in a certain way so that it applies to everybody, immaterial of whether they are Hindus or non-Hindus. So that is really a line that a lot of people in that era took. And in this case, Chandi Dasdi, he says that uniformity of law may be a palatable expression, but it is doubtful whether it is possible or not, or if it is a necessity or not, if it is a desideratum or not, which means whether somebody even is asking for it or not. And the Hindu sages, they have enjoined the customs and usages of each place. If they don't go against the Shastras, they should be kept intact. So again, these are contradictions where our own traditional Shastra-based discourse was much more conducive to diversity, where our own rishis, starting from, let's say, Yugas away and more contemporary rishis, even in the Kali era, everybody, they all enjoined that customs and usages should be respected, and so long as they are not going against the Shastras, and they should all be kept intact. So this is a very conflicting viewpoint compared to what the Hindu code bill then or the Uniform Civil Code now will attempt, which is to say that I want to define one rule for all. So you have again more people here trying to throw light on this particular aspect. Now this is an opinion from somebody called Ananta Krishna Sastri, and he says that the sources that are recognized by the Hindu jurisprudence in terms of laws are the Mimamsa Shastras, Shruti, Smriti, and Sadachara. So he says that legislation is not a source of Hindu's law, and even the king under the Hindu law is bound by Dharma, and he's not a maker of Dharma. So this is something I tried to emphasize at the start of this talk as well, that the traditional understanding on law was that it has components of Shruti, it has components of Smriti, it has components of Sadachara, which is all the customs and various practices that emerge over time. But legislation is not a source of Hindu law, in the sense that the king also was seen as a maker of Dharma, but not seen as a maker of Dharma. He was seen as somebody who was trying to administer it. And the legislature cannot hence claim higher rights than the kings of the yore. So essentially, the judges also should only interpret laws, but they should not attempt to create laws, particularly in domain where they are strictly into the religious domain. So you have people say such things, questioning the competency, questioning the authority of the legislature in trying to amend or change or reform religion. So you also have some institutions that gave their opinion in that era. So you have Shibpur Chatuspati, which is these institutions of Sanskrit learning primarily that used to exist in various parts of the country. So this one is from Bengal, and they are voicing their opinion that they are saying this thing, that we used to have this process of accommodating change in our past. So it is not that we were a static society where you have one rule and say that this is the rule and nothing is going to change. From times immemorial, whenever it became necessary to make any change in any department, social, religious, legal, political, whatever that be, it used to be done by those people, scholars and rishis, who are versed in fundamental principles guiding the whole cosmic process, the existence and evolution of the human race, which is the entire Sanatana Dharmic worldview. And whenever they are attempting to do a change, or in all points in time, they were always keeping the ideals of Hinduism in view, and it is under those ideals that they used to accommodate this change. And Shibpur Chatuspati, they say this, that these people or these scholars or these authorized people, they used to come forward whenever necessary, and they were competent to dictate the changes. And these changes would then be adopted as legislations, and they would then be passed to the kings as executives who would administer some of these laws. And they bring up this very interesting point that when the Kumbh Mela happens, the Kumbh Mela was a meeting place of legislators and executives to discuss about the state of the country and changes to be adopted. Now, this is something very fascinating, where Kumbh Mela, which is today treated as a religious gathering, it also had a legal function from what these people are voicing then, is to say that it was not just a place where people used to gather to perform their rites and do the sacred bath. It was also a meeting place for legislators and executives to discuss about the state of the country and changes to be adopted. Now, just imagine this kind of a model versus a model where today, let's say, English-speaking people sitting in some courts wearing black coats, they are trying to pass judgments on Hinduism, versus a model where you have this kind of an open framework of a Kumbh Mela, and various people from various corners of the country, they come in, and then change is still happening, but change is happening within the bounds of religion, versus it happening with some kind of a top-down arrogance or top-down reformist secular mindset. So the most lamentable aspect of the present state of affairs, as per the Shivpur Chatuspati in that era, they say that the true ideals of Hindus are not known to those who are now occupying the position of being the Bhagya Vidatas of Hindus. So these are the people who are, let's say, the legislators, the people in courts of law, or people in positions of power, bureaucrats, so on. We see it happen now as well. These are really our Bhagya Vidatas of our times. But these Bhagya Vidatas, they are not sufficiently trained on the ideals of Hinduism. And a lot of times they tend to succumb to the force or like the pressure of reform without paying attention to what they are compromising in that process. So the Shivpur Chatuspati, that school says that the Bhagya Vidatas of that era, they have become westernized externally and internally both, and they are apt to see and judge everything according to the ideals of materialism, not knowing that such ideals cannot and will not be able to maintain the existence of the community in the long run as being against the fundamental natural laws. So this friction between materialism and tradition is something that some people acknowledged then in that era. But in our times today, it's getting very, very difficult to even get people to appreciate or acknowledge that this is indeed a friction, indeed a valid friction. A lot of our people, although they are Hindus, the worldview that dominates them is very, very materialistic. And in a lot of times, in case of such very important social political matters, we tend to judge everything by a materialistic standard, or you only live once kind of a standard, where we really don't try to understand the import of the whole karma, janma, papa, punya, the shraddha, that kind of ritual, and adhikara, and things like that, where there is a very, very different worldview that emerges when you look at life as not just this particular life, or this particular instance of life alone, and as an eternal cycle. And when you look at the entire universe as a sentient being, it's very, very different from the materialistic, consumeristic conception of life that we have today. And some of these dissenting opinions on the Hindu Code Bill, they are really trying to draw attention there to say that whatever is being attempted in the name of reform is happening from a very materialistic kind of a worldview. So now let me jump down south. So I'm just trying to cover opinions from all across the country, and I've just taken some examples of people from Ahmedabad, people from Gujarat, and people from Pune, Maharashtra, and then Bengal. Now let me jump down south. Let me go to somebody called Shiva Krishna Iyer, who was an advocate in Madras, and he says this thing that. So he's asking this question, which is important again in the UCC context, where he's asking that why are we setting up a code for Hindus for advancing their culture or attempting to reform? In the name of like advancing their culture, we are trying to set up this code. But why is it that only Hindus are touched, and why is it that the Musalmans are not touched? And he's in fact posing the counter question, saying that if the Musalman does not want the legislature to interfere in his personal law, should that not be a pointer for us to preserve our own personal law intact and allow questions under it to be settled in accordance with our own scriptural authorities based on Smritis and Sadachara? Why is it that when a Muslim says that his legislature, the legislature should not interfere in his own personal law, we are okay with it? But as Hindus, we are just succumbing to this pressure that we are allowing legislature or judiciary to tamper with our laws. Now, this is a very important question because as this whole debate on UCC picks up in our times now, we are going to see this happen all over again, where we are going to see protests or dissent from certain quarters. Definitely, it has already, one can already see this happen. In fact, last week, you can see some particular Islam or Muslim councils voice opinions against the Uttarakhand government's move to do the like enact the Uniform Civil Code, where they are saying that you cannot enter into the territory of religion, and this is not for you to intervene and define what how we need to conduct our lives, so on and so forth. So this is something that happened then, and at that point in time, for various political and ideological reasons, the Islam was left intact, Christianity to an extent was left intact, and it was really Hinduism, Jainism, so on, who were under the chopping block for this particular intervention in terms of the code bill. And it's a very, very important point to ask that if a Muslim is saying that I don't want the legislature to interfere in my personal law, why are Hindus not taking it as a pointer to preserve their own personal law intact? And why are they allowing the questions in their personal law to be settled by a secular authority and not a scriptural authority? So there is another bar association in Tamil Nadu in Devakota who again asked this question that you are doing this Hindu code bill reform in the name of progress, but what exactly is this progress is nowhere defined, nor is it definable. And there are several views that are not subjected to criticism. So you have this whole worship of progress that is happening even in our times today, but nobody really bothers to define progress. It is always about the current thing. So if the current thing is gender reform, everybody runs around the gender reform. Tomorrow, if it is something else, they go there. But there is no real definition of what progress really is all about. So it is here that the Bar Association of Devakotai, they say this, that what appears progress at one time under certain conditions, they may not be progress at other times. What is progress according to one view may not be progress according to others. And the committees, the Hindu law committee's attempt is in substance an attempt to coerce one section, which is the Hindus, and to say that like I'm going to reform your code alone because you are not progressive enough. So they protested this, and they say that the codification interferes with the spontaneous growth and flexibility of the Hindu law. And the Hindu law is based on religion, while the Hindu code appears to make it secular. And this is interfering with the basic principles, and you are trying to loosen the hold of religion on the Hindu mind. So this is something somebody told in 1945, and you can really understand how much the hold of religion on Hindu mind has loosened now, looking at what is happening inside our heads and even outside in the society today, that a lot of us today don't have a great conception of how much control or how much real estate we want to give to religion in our own day-to-day lives. We have compartmentalized so many things as secular today that the real realm of religion is shrinking day by day, and it continues to shrink all along as well. So I'll take another 10 minutes just to give a kind of a glimpse on some more of these opinions, and then conclude. So this is another opinion here by somebody called Venkata Raman Sharma, who is again a lawyer down south. And he's again trying to say this, that there is a system of natural evolution that was happening with the Hindu law, where you have the Smritikaras who are trying to change Smritis from time to time, although the time gaps are really into hundreds and thousands of years in some cases. But there is change. It is not a static edifice. There is this whole interface that is happening with local customs. So this used to happen. But what the code is trying to attempt here is to say that I'm trying to unite one common law for everybody. And you are really trying to stop this natural evolution that is happening in the Hindu society. And that is something Venkata Raman Sharma ji, let's say, he contested. And he said this, that it will lead only to the entire annihilation of a whole system, religion, and community. So some of this is very prophetic, because if you look at from the times then to now, 80 years have passed, and a lot of spheres where we used to consider religion in the past has now been annihilated, and Hinduism is not as wholesome anymore, and it is very piecemeal in our times today. So you have now one more opinion is from Shankaracharya, from a particular mutt in Mysore, where he says this, that the only person who are really clamoring for this code, they are a small fraction, and they belong to this race of he calls as the race of Lord Macaulay, which is again this is something that a lot of people use over time, where this is really a set of people who are Hindu in color and blood only, but anti-Hindu in every other respect, in terms of their intellect, in sentiments, in morals, in their manners. They're anti-Hindu, or very English, or very European in their thinking. And here the Shankaracharya ji says that this handful of men at the top, they pass themselves as leaders of thought, and they are in fashion, of course, and they unthinkingly set this ball in motion. They set the ball of reform in motion, and from their heights of power, influence, and wealth. And then the people in the lower rung, they catch this rolling ball, and then they toss it and turn with the ball end to end. So the Hindu Law Committee, the legislature, and the government, they have done this kind of an arrangement, where they are trying to bulldoze their opinion onto the opinion of the millions of people in the country then, while they have contrary opinions, but nobody really asked them, nobody really heard them. It is just from top down, a certain set of people who are close to power, who have access to power, they are just trying to enforce their worldview on everybody else. So this is something that was contested then. Now, here there is somebody called Natesha Iyer, who is again an advocate. He is trying to contest these accusations that we continue to hear in our times today, that your laws are very old or archaic. So he says this thing, Natesha Iyer says this, that if you say they are archaic, then yes, they certainly are, in the sense that a lot of them are thousands of years old. But then the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the rivers, the seas, and the earth, they are all archaic in this sense, but nobody thinks of changing them. And the age of the laws, far from making against them, that is really their merit. So he's really trying to emphasize this fact, that the fact that you are a continuing civilization, and the fact that you have laws that are continuing from several hundreds and thousands of years, that is not something that should go against them. It is in fact the merit of these particular laws. So here Natesha Iyer ji again makes this a very important observation, which is something that a lot of people in that era have made, which is again very, very important in the Uniform Civil Code context in our times today, where the Natesha Iyer ji here says that what these people who are trying to define this Hindu Code Bill or the Hindu law in that era, they are trying to do is to essentially Muslimize Hindustan, he says. So the draft Hindu law, he says, is 90% Mohammedan law. And it is a thin, truncated, castrated Hindu skeleton that is left after this intervention. And Natesha Iyer ji says that the Hindu skeleton, you have plucked the eyes, you have cut the ears, the nose is bitten off, the arms are chopped, and the legs are lopped. After all this, to call it Hindu code is an abuse of language, he says. And he says that this suicidal policy of Muslimizing and westernizing the Hindu law is writ large on every clause of Hindu code bill. And he says that what politicians hope to achieve in the political field by conceding the Frankenstein of Pakistan, which is to partition the country into two and give a certain body to Pakistan, legislatures are really attempting to achieve this in the legislative field by doing this code, or saying that the Hindu code is applicable to Hindus, while there is very little Hindu about it. And a lot of it is really inspired from Mohammedan law and English law. So he says that Natesha Iyer ji says this, that it seems like there is a formidable league of politicians, legislators, and administrators who are trying to somehow get to Hindu-Muslim unity by hook or by crook. Now, if you look at what might potentially happen with Uniform Civil Code in our times, let's say in the coming few years, it is possible that the same formidable league of politicians, legislators, and administrators might again attempt to somehow unite the country in the name of civil code. And in the process, if in the past they have attempted to make it a 90% Mohammedan westernized law with just 10% of Hindu skeleton left, now we might even expand it and get into more areas of law, and we might not even leave that 10% of Hindu psyche that is left in us now. That is definitely a possibility given our past history on these aspects. So it is important to understand the past descent, hence to see what are the grounds on which our own ancestors have protested against this bill, and what is it that they are really arguing for. So in this case, just to give some context on why they are saying that the draft is a 90% Mohammedan law or English law. A lot of the phrases or propositions that were picked up on inheritance, particularly with respect to women, specific clauses, they were all inspired by Islamic law. And a lot of clauses around divorce or separation, they were again inspired by Islamic law. And there were again, you can find a lot of elaborate analysis on these topics, that a lot of inspiration on the Hindu Code Bill or the Hindu Law Committee's proposals, they were really coming from Islam and Christianity, and there was not a lot of stuff in it which was really Hindu about it. Now, there is another opinion from another person called Diwan Bahadur Ramaswamy Sastri, who was a district and sessions judge. So he makes this one-liner, which is again very important. He says this, that you have an elastic system of law allowing the growth of healthy customs, and that elastic system is better than a rigid code. So this argument between rigidity and elasticity is another way of putting the uniformity and diversity argument, where a lot of these people who contested this idea of a uniform code for Hindus in that era, they were continuing to argue that you have a system that is elastic and not rigid. So you are trying to trade off elasticity for rigidity or uniformity, and they continued to contest that piece. Now, another opinion here is from somebody called K.S. Mehta, who belonged to the Madras Shaukars Association. So these are primarily tradesmen and merchants who operated from Madras. And here again, K.S. Mehta is trying to argue that you should not have any kind of a system which is trying to take away all of the variety in day-to-day and trying to establish some kind of a uniformity. So he's trying to throw some light onto the Varnashram Dharma aspects, that while today Varnashram Dharma gets a lot of abuse from various pockets of reformists, both on the Hindu side and outside the Hindu side, he is trying to explain on how Varnashrama Dharma also helped in terms of managing this kind of diversity. So K.S. Mehta says that you had different groups of Hindus who were coming into the Hindu fold over time with their own traditions and customs. And this architecture of Jatis and Varnas enabled all of these people to have their own way of evolving social systems around the Hindu principles, and they had full freedom given within that group to call themselves Hindus, and they could also build and evolve their own systems. And it was not a top-down kind of system where one set of rules were given for everybody to follow. It was a bottom-up system where every jati had its own freedom to evolve its own customs. And he's trying to draw this emphasis that this freedom needs to be valued, and any interference to take away this freedom needs to be contested. So up till now, meaning up till that era of 1945, he says that even in the reforming days, nobody disturbed this system through many kings and emperors who appeared and vanished and moved away over time. None of them tried to reform this kind of a custom-driven law framework that we had across various jatis. And this is the first time in independent, close to independent India, where this attempt was made. And hence, there were this whole bunch of people who protested on that note. Of course, I mean, I don't want to get into specifics on Varnashram Dharma here, because that's a very contested topics and people may have very strong opinions. But I just want to draw emphasis that the architecture of Varnashram Dharma was also helpful in retaining the very popular ideal of unity and diversity. So you have another organization which is a very, very strong conservative orthodox organization of that era called the Varnashram Swarajya Sangh. And that was a national body. This is called All India Varnashram Swarajya Sangh, where there were representatives of this body across the country in various cities and towns. And this was a body that again contested the Hindu Code Bill very heavily. Now, again, as I mentioned, while you may or may not agree and have differing opinions on the whole idea of Varnashrama, but the principles based on which that this Sangh argued then is still valid even for our times today, because they are trying to say this, that a lot of this agitation, agitation or the tendency to reform is happening because a lot of people are dazzled by Western materialistic civilization, and they are failing to realize the devastating character of an uncritical blind surrender to that model and how that conflicts with tradition. And they were in fact trying to question the people who are trying to perpetrate this kind of a reform model. So these people, they are trying to say this, that Hinduism was not founded on one day, or it was not founded by one person. It was not founded by, we didn't have a prophet. We don't have a prophet in the same sense of Islam has Muhammad, or like Christ, or Zoroaster for the Zoroastrians, and Buddha for the Buddhists. So it's a very different kind of religion. It is structured very differently. And because you have a religion that is structured like this, it has its own forms in religious social institutions, customs, rights, duties, so on. So it is not correct for this kind of a sovereign legislative interference on matters of religion. And this body contested that it is a misuse of powers by the legislature to codify Hindu law and trying to coerce people to submit to interference with their rights, beliefs, and faith in their own religious social institutions. So again, this body, they contested this, that there are 80 million Muslims in that era, and they're asking this question, that if you have 80 million Muslims, why are their laws not being codified? And why are customary laws of all other communities in India, why are they not being codified? What is this compelling necessity to codify the Hindu customary law alone? And that's where they are trying to say this, that you have this heterodox body called legislature formed by Hindus and non-Hindus. And in fact, they say that these are people who hate Hinduism and want to supplant it by some other religion. How are these people competent to legislate for Hindus? So that's a question that recurs continuously across all these opinions, where people are contesting the competency of people who are trying to reform Hinduism. So again, here you continue to hear this thing that, but the public wants it. The voice of general Hindu public is towards progress, towards reform. And these people question that as well, that when you say general Hindu public, that's a very elusive word. There is no proper efficient machinery or test to determine what this general public means and what is this principle that is acceptable to the general public and what is not. And this is the confusion that we continue to have today, that people continue to take power into their hands and make judgments, and they take authority into their hands, saying that they are representative of the general Hindu public opinion without having any great mechanism to determine what the general Hindu public opinion really is. So here the Subramania Iyer from the All India Varnashram Swarajya Sangh, he also draws this reference to United States of America, US, which is still valid for our times today. So he's asking this question, that there are so many states there and every state has its own law. Why are you not asking for uniformity there? If they can have laws per state, why can't we have our own customs and our own laws like this? And in fact, this is something that came up even recently, where, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, you had people ask for increasing the age of marriage. So you have this kind of variation across states in the US. You have this kind of variation across countries. So there is this whole clamor for uniformity that doesn't even exist anywhere else in the world, because it is very difficult to uniformize all these kind of diversities that are innate to humanity, perhaps, where everybody has their own worldviews and their own ways of looking at things. So even in the United States, you have all these, the federal structure, and every state has its own laws and its own sphere in so many matters. So people in 1945, like the Varnashram Swarajya Sangh, which was protesting against Hindu Code Bill, they tried to draw a parallel there, that why should we alone, Hindus alone, have this uniform code, while everywhere else in the world, people can continue to have multiple laws based on their jurisdictions. So they continue to emphasize on this, that uniformity, which is in itself not unmixed good or blessing. It should be you are attempting to obtain this uniformity by the most progressive elements in the schools of law, and then you're trying to synthesize these by trying to say whatever is good by my standards of progress in this particular smriti, in this particular law book, I'll take it. Whatever is not good by my standards of progress, I'll reject. So these people are asking this question, that what is this test or standard for progress? Is it from a spiritual point of view, or is it from a material point of view? And they also say that no two religionists can agree on what progress is. So this is something that we can find today between, let's say, the reforms that are attempted in Islam as well, where there are progress is something that is a very nebulous term, and what one person considers progress is not considered as progress by someone else. They consider it as a regress. So these the Varnashram Swarajya Sangh tried to emphasize on this, that you should first clarify on what is it that you want. When you talk of progress, what exactly is it? And they say that the only test of progress so far as religion and religious institutions are concerned are our own customs, our own rights, and our own duties, which are based on religion, and they should be the standard, and that should be the only standard by which religious matters should be judged, and not this kind of a nebulous, non-religious, secular standard of progress. So they try to emphasize, again, as I try to draw attention to through the course of the talk, that they try to emphasize on the law of karma, the law of rebirth or reincarnation, and that secular institutions are not competent to understand all of this, and they should not be allowed to get into this kind of a religious kind of a territory. And they try to say this, that these people who are trying to enforce their progressive views, they think that the Hindu laws, notions, beliefs, and institutions are not conducive to progress of human society, and they are fully in awe of a Western secular atheistic kind of a mindset. So that continues to play out even in our times today, that we really have not given much of an agency anymore for anybody who wants to stand by tradition and to even define tradition. So I'll just take another 5 minutes perhaps to quickly wrap this up. There are a couple of more interesting opinions that I want to draw attention to, and then probably we could conclude this particular talk for today. So now there is a particular body here in Vijayawada in Andhra Pradesh, and a representative of that body, D. Srinivas Sharma, is that person who is giving his opinion on this particular topic here. Now, the reason why I'm bringing these names and these regions is really to draw some light onto this point, that these are not like your like Gandhi's, Netaji, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. These are not these kind of people voicing opinions. While you have maybe luminaries also involved in this topic, they are really common concerned Hindus who woke up in that era, and all over the country, these are just concerned Hindus who are offering their dissenting opinions. Of course, there are people who agreed to the Hindu Code Bill as well, but that's a different story altogether. My interest is in the people who offer dissenting opinions. So I'm just taking these names because these are just common people who are, let's say, advocates, people who are just merchants, people who are representatives of some bodies. These are the people who got together and gave their opinion on these particular topics. So here, Srinivas Sharma ji is trying to say that if you look at this whole idea of Hindu society, and if you look at, let's say, past civilizations of Rome, of Athens, of Egypt, they all haven't survived anymore. But we still are here today, and we do have connecting links of heredity between the present inhabitants and our own past thinkers. So we still talk of Ramayana, we still talk of Mahabharata, we still talk of our Puranas, we still take references to Vedas, Upanishads. So we are not culturally disconnected in the same way as a modern Greek or a modern Italian is today from their own Roman past and Greek past. So the continuity is not yet lost for Indians, though it is reducing as we speak, and it has perhaps shrunk from the 1940s to now even further. But the desire for immortality is something that is inherent in all human beings, which is that human beings innately want some sort of continuity and connect. And it is here that Srinivas Sharma ji tries to say that the Hindu way of doing this kind of a continuity was in this whole idea of inheritance, that each individual parent they desire that their son should inherit the fine qualities from the parent. And this kind of there's a kind of community in community continuity, and there is a inheritance and immortality. All of this is really coming through in this line of continuity that we have from generation to generation to generation. So this racial immortality, as Sharmaji uses, that racial immortality is achieved by the preservation of habits, customs, traditions, culture, philosophy, and art that are particular and peculiar to that particular race. And this whole model of preservation, it wants that kind of unbroken line of descent. So if you look at how we used to operate in the past, the emphasis was really on this continuity. Now, of course, professional continuity is maybe something that can still be contested in our times today, given all the change that is happening today. But in terms of habits, customs, and traditions, a lot of emphasis was still on maintaining these diversities by having individual lines of continuities across various families and various jatis. So their primary objection to the proposed Hindu code was that it cuts at the root of this particular Hindu tradition and belief that this continuity is important, and that you are governed not by man-made law, but by smritis, which are based on shrutis, which are in turn divine revelations. So the fact that this kind of a secular intervention is trying to go to the root of the Hindu belief, this is something that these people contested in that era. And in here, Srinivas Sharmaji makes a remark that once this faith in the model of divine revelation, or in the model of superhuman authority, once that vanishes, then most of the provisions of this proposed code will appear very reasonable and very much in conformity with modern civilized ideas. So if you see as to how a lot of us today look at a lot of this reform, we might see that, okay, I mean, this looks reasonable to me. Why is it that these guys are protesting? Because our own worldview is now detached. We don't consider a lot of things that our own ancestors considered sacred. They are not sacred to us anymore. So when we look at their insistence on who should inherit property and how that ties up to, let's say, the Shraddha rituals, today we might think that this looks reasonable to me. I think it is okay if everybody inherits, because our own worldview of what we consider sacrosanct has now changed. And that is what people in that era try to emphasize, that the whole idea of what is tradition and what is not then is changing with the reformist current. And we can now see the effects in our era, where a lot of us today don't have this kind of a conception on what tradition is. So there's again this small body in Vishakhapatnam which gave its opinions. Now that is interesting for this particular talk today, is also because this particular body is also going to the root of the European thought. So this ad hoc committee on Hindu law in Vishakhapatnam, they are actually talking about Bentham, who is a famous English European philosopher, and they have gone to the origins of who is this person who tried to first invent this idea of a codified law, and why is this whole clamor happening. So they tried to contrast between Bentham and a German legal philosopher called Savigny, who was his chief opponent then. And Savigny interestingly argued that he's opposed to this principle of codification, and his desire is that law should gradually develop by silent internal forces of national consciousness with the least possible interference by the legislature. So if you look at the traditionalist standpoint, it was very similar, that they were not contesting change, but they were contesting change from top-down secular legislative authorities. They were saying that change should happen through these silent internal forces of national consciousness, and this is not something that should be top-down from legislative bodies on top. So that's really what I wanted to touch base here in terms of today's lecture, in terms of all of these opinions on the Hindu Code Bill that emerged in 1945. I'll just quickly conclude with one line from somebody from, he's a professor in Dharma Shastra called Netesha Sharma from Vidyapit in Lahore. So given it is 1945, there were people in Pakistan who were giving opinions on Hindu Code Bill. And this person actually says this, that no king, be it a Jain king or a Buddhist king or a Muslim king or like a Mughal, nobody ever tried to do something like this. in terms of trying to reform the entire Hindu worldview. And it is sad that people who are bearing the name of Hindus are attempting this. So that is something that continues to happen in our era today, that a lot of reform that is happening now is not something that even Britishers didn't attempt. It is not something that Islamic conquerors didn't attempt, but Hindus, in their own urge to reform, in their own urge to stay progressive, they continue to like keep on reforming, so much so that a lot of people today say reform is our only tradition. So that is something that should worry each one of us. And the attempt here through this talk today was try to throw some light on some of these dissenting opinions, so that each one of us really tries to get to the root of trying to understand what our tradition is, and make in their own individual capacities, try to make an attempt to contest, to engage with tradition, and then engage with the world better, so that we can at least answer for ourselves and our own ancestors when the question comes on what is a good reform and what is a bad reform. So I'm not trying to, let's say, take the Ambedkarite line here to say like educate, agitate, and organize. It is more of first educate yourself on your tradition, be aware of what is happening around you, and then speak up, because traditional Hindus today are not speaking up, and the only reformist voices are what are there in the outside world, particularly in the public discourse. So the whole attempt here was to emphasize that you need to speak up, you need to understand your own tradition, you need to speak up, and you can draw inspiration from a whole bunch of your own ancestors in the past.
Yeah, Namaste ji. It was a very interesting talk that I heard. Usually what I encounter, or many of us in this generation encounter online, is we are often told that, or the common perception is that in 1950, when all this was happening, at least a few people in the parliament who had no standing in tradition, who made laws which did not represent most of the population. But now, hearing from the talk, it seems there was a lot of dissenting opinions on the framing of this Hindu Code Bill. So, what happened? Why did this bill even pass if such was the magnitude of the dissent that was coming in?
Right, that's a very good question. In fact, it's interesting that a lot of this dissent and seeking public opinion happened before independence. So this, all of what I quoted is from 1945, 2 years before independence, and all of the action on actually passing the bill happened post-independence. So the people who had the authority pre-independence were much more interested in seeking public opinion, and the people in authority post-independence somehow felt that whatever public opinion that was sought in the past was perhaps good enough, and they didn't make any explicit attempt to reach out post-independence. And if you look at how the bills have been passed, it is very clearly reflective that it is just people in power who could just bulldoze through their opinions. So it's an important question to ask in terms of what needs to be done in terms of this kind of interventions in the future as well, where like the plebiscite model, of course, is very inefficient, but we should still have some way in which public can be consented, public opinion is taken and valued before the legislator or the judiciary goes ahead. I think we should definitely have some sort of a model on this. Otherwise, you really see on like kind of things that happen, let's say around the Shabarimala issue, where people had to take to the streets to voice their dissent. But it is interesting that a lot of dissent did indeed happen on the Hindu Code Bill, and thankfully, at least it is documented. So at least we have some evidence to even understand what sort of dissent is.
Yeah, sorry, just one more follow-up question which I have. In all the reading that you've done so far, have you ever encountered, because this was in 1947, there were around 562 princely states, we are told, and most of them had their own customs and traditions and certain rules which they would have followed from the smritis or the shrutis or a merger, like you said. So one famous example is the Kingdom of Travancore, which is now in we are not told the Padmanabha Swami temple traditions and all. So did that factor when these kingdoms joined the Union of India? Did any agreement or some sort happen where they wanted their rules to factor in, which did not play out later? Was any sort of thing? Did anything like that happen?
Yes, so you can see those discussions as well that emerge later. So these statements are from 1945, but even in 1945, when a lot of these people were voicing their opinions, at that time, one of the proposals was that the princely states will be excluded, and only those states that were directly under the dominion of British, they will have this Hindu law, because that whole takeover of princely states, if you were to use that word, that happened later with Sardar Patel and post-independence. But you do see flavors of that kind of discussions emerge in here, where people say that I have my own kind of customs, my own kind of flavor in my territory, and I don't want that to be disturbed by a uniform law. So that continued to show up in 1945, and then you can find instances of it in some of the letters and material available from various princely states as well. So it did happen, but the emphasis here was more on, since the Hindu Law Committee was focused on some of these states where there was direct British control, they sought opinions more from that dominion, while people did talk about the princely states as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a question for Kalyan, which is essentially subsequently, I mean, since the topic overall is also contemporary relevance, subsequently over the years and decades, has there been any move on how the current Hindu code bills should be modified to get them more in line with what, let's say, the original critics would have had in mind? So, if not a complete reversal, then what kind of modifications or changes? Has there been any kind of critique from the traditionalist side subsequently over the decades?
Yeah, great question. In fact, I think that is something that I found very, very strange in my own reading and research on this topic. That a lot of these bodies that were active and alive and making so much noise in the 1940s, they pretty much died down after that. You actually will not find any reference to several of these bodies after the Hindu Code Bill was passed, or after the early 50s. A lot of these associations and bodies have just vanished. And the whole traditionalist discourse itself, if you look at it, has vanished from that era, because I think a lot of focus after that was on secularization, development, and the poverty, socialism to capitalism transition. Possibly we didn't pay enough attention to religion after that. As a people, looks like that no attempt was made. And now perhaps is the right time, given all these debates that are now again emerging once again in terms of the Uniform Civil Code. It is perhaps a good idea that, let's say, hypothetically speaking, today, if all of the Muslims contest this idea that I don't want to reform civil code, I want to remain Muslim as per my Muslim law, will Hindus then say that if you don't want the civil code, then I'll not take the Hindu code either. I want to go back to my Hindu traditional law. And at that time, this question will definitely be relevant, that if I am not going to be governed by this particular Hindu code bill, then what should I be governed by? And that will probably open up this whole discussion all over once again, to understand what will the traditional perspective on life again be. So it's a very important question, but we'll have to see whether that question will be considered important by Hindus in the coming few years.
I would like to know one more aspect of who all went into the making of Hindu code bill at this point of time, and was there any Madhadipatis and heads of this our religion who involved in drafting any part of it, or at least some aspects of it? Was there any involvement at all of the Madhadipatis? I don't know whether that has happened at all. And if so, if not happened, as Puri Swami always lament, the government is not involving any of these Matadipatis in anything related to Hindu. That becomes the most irritating, rather stifling point for Hindus to get a better deal in all this codification.
Right. So from what I have seen, the Matadipatis, Pitadipatis were heavily involved, but not in the drafting part, but in criticizing the draft. So their engagement, they were not called for formulating the actual draft, but when it was opened up, several of these Matadhipatis belonging to various customs and traditions, all of them severely contested this idea of interfere of a secular legislative body trying to interfere into religion and not even involving the Pitadhipatis and Matadhipatis in the drafting part of it. So I think that continues to be a strong point of contention and friction to this day, that a lot of people continue to question the competency of these the courts or even the executive and legislative bodies which try to reform religion, because a lot of them are not even believers in the first place. Even if they are not sufficiently trained in their own religion to do judgmental calls on reforming their religion. So there was no evidence of consulting any of these Matadhipatis during the drafting of this bill. All evidence we see is only them offering dissenting opinions and then the government not paying attention to any of those dissenting opinions.